Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world. I am back from traveling to South America and Antarctica. If you want to see what that's like, check out some of the pics that I put on my Substack at America Abroad. And I, of course, want to thank Carla Robbins, who so expertly hosted the conversation at World Review these past few weeks. So let's get started with this week's show. It's Friday, February 6th. As we record, U.S. and Iranian negotiators are meeting in Oman to see whether some kind of deal is possible. President Trump has assembled what he calls an armada of force to pressure Iran, but what's less clear is what this pressure aims to do. A nuclear deal better than the one that Trump torpedoed in 2018, or the end of Iran's support for regional allies, all of whom have already been weakened by Israeli strikes over the past few months? Regime change? Who knows? We'll discuss. Then we'll turn to another set of talks between Ukraine and Russia and the United States, which concluded yesterday. No breakthroughs, but we've now had 2 rounds of direct negotiations between the warring parties, and that matters. But so does the bombardment of Ukraine's energy infrastructure that continues unabated at a time that temperatures in Kyiv and around the rest of the country have plummeted. So are we any closer to ending the war, or is this all a show by Kyiv and Moscow to stay on Donald Trump's good side? And finally, Europe is embarking on a new policy of de-risking, not just from China, but from its erstwhile ally and partner, the United States. In Davos may have been a turning point when Canadian Prime Minister Carney's speech rallied Americans' European allies to stand together. Buy European, digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, these are the new European catchphrases. But is it just talk, or is it real this time? Here to discuss all of these stories are 3 reporters who covered them. Catherine Philp is World Affairs Editor at The Times and one of Britain's most experienced foreign correspondents, having covered 5 continents in nearly 20 years for The London Times. She's been based overseas and reported on conflicts from Afghanistan to Colombia. And here's my favorite. She's judgmental about hummus and quite poor at looting the residences of fallen despots. We're going to find out about this, Catherine. Great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Suzanne Lynch is Brussels bureau chief of Bloomberg News. She's reported from Dublin and Washington and Brussels for both Politico and the Irish Times, and authors the weekday Brussels edition newsletter. Suzanne, wonderful to have you back on the show.
Delighted to be back. Great to be joining a great panel.
And Jamie Dettmer is opinion editor and foreign affairs columnist for Politico Europe. Jamie has reported on wars on 5 continents and has been variously based out of Rome, London, Ukraine, Libya, Lebanon, and Turkey. He's also been bureau chief in Washington, D.C., Moscow, Rome, and Belfast, and a columnist for nearly half a dozen newspapers. Most importantly, he's my editor at Politico Europe. Hey, Jamie, it's great to have you on for the first time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and make sure you meet the deadline for the piece next week.
Yeah, deadlines. It never changes. Catherine Philp of the London Times. Let's start with you. U.S.-Iran talks in Oman are still ongoing as far as we know, just as we're speaking. Big differences divide these 2 countries, as they have for the last almost 50 years now. Iran wants to talk about nuclear issues and sanctions relief. The United States wants to talk about a whole bunch of other issues. So tell us, how did we get to this point? Why are we talking? What is the armada that has been put together all about? Just help us explain where we are.
Yeah, so I guess most people listening to this will be aware that there's been lots of dire warnings about the possibility of renewed conflict in the Middle East because of what's going on with the massive armada powering its way to the Gulf now. It is the first time that Iran and the US have sat down face to face since they were essentially lost at war very briefly last June. So that was when Israel launched strikes on Iran and the US came in and hit nuclear facilities. So there was a moment about 3 weeks ago, people may recall that that Donald Trump told the protesters in Iran, whilst those massive protests were going on against the regime, that help was coming. And he was about to intervene, and he actually didn't. For various reasons, mostly because no one in the region, including Israel, seemed to want him to do it at that point, but also because that embargo was not in place. Now that it is, in that intervening time, a lot of those vessels have actually left the Caribbean and were involved in blockading Venezuela. There's been a lot of talk about the tensions being very, very high, that the risk of a strike is imminent. Now, the first thing that happened with these talks this week was that Iran succeeded in having them relocated from Istanbul to Oman. I thought that was very interesting because that showed that Iran was able to somehow project some of its needs or desires of what comes out of this process. Because the reason it did that was it wants to keep these talks only on the nuclear issue, and it felt that Oman might be better, the mediators in Oman might be better disposed to helping it do that. So that was kind of a win for Iran too. Now, obviously, it doesn't want military action against it. It has been militarily weakened by what happened last June. It's been weakened domestically by what happened with the protests. So it's very eager to push this off, but not so much so that it wants to open up all issues of Washington's interest to discover. So Washington went into this saying that they wanted to discuss all the issues, including the protesters, including the regional proxies, the ballistic missiles, and the nuclear program. Now, it seems that the first mood music we've already got out of those talks came from Iran being terribly positive about it, saying that they'd stuck on the nuclear portfolio, clearly not wanting to drift off. The US have just come out and slapped new sanctions on Iran's export of oil. So I think that we're still seeing that the two sides are very far apart, but it hasn't all exploded. We're not seeing, Tehran being hit with airstrikes tonight. And I mean, one of my personal theories about that is that Trump doesn't really want to do this, and that Israel has been pushing this agenda quite a lot, and has, having called things off 3 weeks ago, is now pushing for it. But there's a mismatch of purpose and motive here. What does Trump want out of this? Does he just want a win? Does he want to be seen to have cowed Iran? I mean, he's claimed to have destroyed the nuclear programs. It's a bit awkward to just discuss that. But everyone else in the region, of course, is saying, no, don't do this. You just don't know where this could go, especially with the regime feeling that it's under an absolutely existential threat, with obviously the internal turmoil. So I think we're really looking at this balancing act of what different people want out of what happens in Iran. And obviously Israel, Netanyahu, would like to see regime change, would like to see the end of the Islamic regime, the end of the nuclear program, and the end of the ballistic missile program. I think the proxies are possibly less of an issue right now because they've been so badly damaged by what Israel has done over the last 2 years. But it seems that these talks are going to continue. They're not over yet. Today's are, but I think they're going to continue in the future. And as long as Iran can continue to stall this, that keeps things on a simmer.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway from this as I look at it is, confusion in Washington as well, a mismatch between different wings of MAGA world and the White House. You've got on one hand, elements of the MAGA supporters, people like Steve Bannon, for example, who were, very loath to go back into forever wars. You've got other skeptics, America First skeptics like J.D. Vance himself, who back in October 2024 said, under no circumstances should we go to war with Iran. It'd be a huge distraction and we'll waste our resources. And this goes back to his pre-MAGA days when, as a Marine in Iraq, he was very skeptical about American intervention in the Middle East. So I think we have that going on. I do agree with Catherine. I think that, Bibi's position has been the same for the last 3 decades. He's Mr. Iran. He wants the end of the regime. My suspicion is, and I remember writing a column in the summer about this, is I think he rather lured Trump into the strikes in June. I mean, Trump held back initially, he watched what happened, but I think he opportunistically jumped on it because he thought it would be a quick win. And I think from Trump's point of view, he'll always go for a quick win. I think that's his track record.
Yeah, no, I think that's I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think everyone would like to see the regime gone, ballistic missiles gone, the nuclear program gone. The fundamental question for all of us has been for so long: how do you do that militarily? Because it's not clear how you do it militarily. And Suzanne, I mean, clearly those are the goals that Europeans have long been pushing. Certainly, the nuclear side, the ballistic missile, little one, but it's the Europeans actually who started the negotiating process back in 2003 with the Iranians. And so how are they looking at this situation right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, back in the JCPOA days, I mean,
That's the nuclear agreement signed in
the new
2015 for yeah.
exactly during the Obama presidency, and that was that nuclear deal that was signed with Iran. The EU played a very central role in that, and I mean, one of the the constraints of the European Union is that it doesn't really have that much power in foreign policy. Usually, it's member states, individual countries, Berlin, Paris, etc., that have that power to decide on their own military spending and their own military policy. But with Iran, actually, it was one of these areas where the EU did get involved. So it's always had an interest here in keeping that deal going. And then, of course, more recently, now they did vote. France was a little bit opposed originally, but they did decide to sanction the Revolutionary Guard in at a foreign affairs ministers meeting in Brussels. So I think it is a case that, I mean, a lot of the Europeans are watching, not quite from the sidelines, but as with everything with Trump foreign policy, they're trying to read the runes, exactly what Catherine was describing there. What is the end game here? What is the policy? Who is making that policy? And again, they are searching for signs of that. But I think, there is a sense now, to make the obvious comparison, obviously with Venezuela, there was this sense that, Trump is building up a presence there near Venezuela, and he did go in. Now, obviously, the two are very, very different. You can't compare them, but in a sense, if you're looking for intent, well, he kind of flagged that before in Venezuela. He went ahead. Would he do something similar in Iran? But difficult to know what the strategy is and what the end game here is for the United States.
I think that comes across with Arab Gulf leaders and the Europeans as well, and elements within the White House. What is the day after plan? If they're going after regime change, which is what Trump was indicating, a week or 2 weeks ago, now is back just to talking about, according to Caroline Leavitt, the White House press spokesman, it should be purely about the nuclear and zero nuclear capability of Iran. I don't think anyone is convinced that there's a credible endgame there. Certainly the Arab Gulf leaders are really worried about instability, despite all the talking up by elements of the Western media about the Crown Prince. It is absolutely unclear what kind of support he has in there. I suspect not a lot.
The Shah's,
you mean the Shah?
Yeah. The Iranian, the son of the Shah.
Yeah, I mean, the other extraordinary thing is to have a U.S. president urging protesters to go back on the streets and take control of their institutions. Help is on its way, he says. And I think many Iranian protesters believed and went back on the street. I think that will go down as a rather shameful intervention by Trump.
Catherine, I want to comment on that because it is.
When he made that statement, it made me think of nothing more than George H.W. Bush calling on the Shia in Iraq to rise up and then doing absolutely nothing about it. And then, of course, we remember what happened there and how long it took for anything to change in Iraq. And then when it did change, where it went before it sort of come back. I mean, that's been 20 years of chaos in Iraq. So I think this question of, what comes after is a disturbing one. The idea of asking Iranians to rise up and take hold of their institutions. There's only one institution left in Iran that matters, and that's the IRGC. And it's got its tentacles in everything. So even if we were to see the supreme leader overthrown and the clerics sidelined, why would the Revolutionary Guard stand aside? They're so deeply inculcated in an economy that benefits from being closed and off from the rest of the world. They actually economically benefit from the sanctions that are crippling their own people. Quite apart from the security issues and the fact that they're deeply ideological, there is a lot to worry about if indeed you did go in and pursue regime change, which I personally don't think Trump wants to do, because he hasn't even done it in Venezuela. He did a quick hit. He did something that actually Israel would be far better equipped to do in a scenario, in a theater like Iran, that kind of raid. But it's one thing doing that in Venezuela, where he clearly co-opted people within the Venezuelan regime. It's quite another thing doing it in a huge country like Iran at at such a critical geopolitical locus.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and it sort of underscores that when you have a policymaker and a policy process that is very much driven by immediate wins as opposed to long-term strategy, sometimes it works. And in Venezuela so far, the downsides haven't become as clear as one had feared. But in a situation that is far more complex, I think rightly, as you say, where the power in some senses with the supreme leader, but it is really with the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which controls the country, including the monopoly on violence. Importantly, getting rid of the leader doesn't get rid of the regime.
On a more potentially positive note, if Trump is really going for a quick win, let's not leave out the main reason why he dismantled the nuclear deal in the first place, because Obama made it. So that having gone, if he could cook something up that he can sell as a replacement for that, something better than what Obama did, that might be enough for him.
Yeah, the best deal in history. We're looking forward to it. Catherine, thanks so much for that. We're speaking today with Catherine Philp of the London Times, Jamie Dettmer of Politico Europe, and Suzanne Lynch of Bloomberg. Jamie, let's go on to the other negotiation, which was just across the Gulf. By the way, with the same U.S. interlocutors. It seems that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the president, are now in almost complete control of all negotiations, not just Gaza, which they did, but also Ukraine, Russia, and now also Iran. So talks were, in fact, taking place in the UAE, second round of direct talks between the Ukrainians and the Russians at a pretty high level, serious level. Should we think that we're getting closer to peace? Where do you see it going?
The $1 million question there is Putin's intentions. I ought to say at the beginning, is he serious? But one thing I noticed, and talking to people who were familiar with these talks, this particular round of discussions that have been going on, Ukrainian officials and American advisors to Zelensky, is a difference in tone and a difference in mood. One advisor was saying to me, before negotiations were like, trying to do things without an anesthetic, nothing was moving. You'd get these long lectures from the Kremlin negotiators on the root causes of this conflict, the historical expansion of NATO and all the rest of it. We've got a team which is slightly different on both sides now. We've got Budanov, the former head of military intelligence of Ukraine, now, of course, head of the presidential office, replacing Andrei Yermak, who had to quit last year. We've got Umarov also involved. They seem to be more practical minded about how they're approaching it. And also on the Russian side, you're seeing more military and intelligence people. We wrote this up before they even started negotiating on this particular round, saying the mood music looked better. Rubio, after these 2 days of talks, also noted that they were more practical and technical and less these long lectures. So that's promising in itself. And we had an exchange of prisoners as well today, which is, confidence building measure. I mean, the big question, though, remains, whether Putin is serious about this, whether in the end he's just stringing Trump along because he wants to stay on his good side, or whether there is something that's changed in the Kremlin. My suspicion is that he's keeping things bubbling. He's being more constructive. But at the same time, he will delay and see what happens with this winter, with this continuing and relentless energy war he's inflicted on Ukraine, and see where the chips fall then. We still have these major sticking points, the key one being on territorial concessions, whether Ukraine gives up territory in the Donbass it still controls and hands over to the Russians. What happens to a nuclear power station in Donbass as well, although I suspect that's less crucial. And the security guarantees. What happens post an agreement? Can there be Western troops on the ground in Russia? And the Kremlin has been pretty consistently and said absolutely no to that. The security guarantees, by the way, are crucial for Zelensky in selling any territorial concessions, I suspect, to the Ukrainians. I mean, Zelensky's in a terribly difficult position. He's damned if he does, and he's damned if he doesn't. There is a split, I believe, in amongst Ukrainians. I've noticed in the months I spend there every year, war weariness increasing, but there will be elements in the army who will see any territorial concessions, I suspect, as a betrayal, a stab in the back. But in terms of the overall music, I think something has shifted. I'm just not too sure that from the Russian side, this isn't more of an elaborate ruse to keep Trump sweet.
I mean, I have my doubts about that too. But Suzanne, I wanted to. What's interesting is these negotiations are between the two warring parties. That is important. But the mediating party is the United States, which last I looked is not part of Europe, although it has interests in Europe. I would argue bigger ones than the president seems to think about. But the Europeans aren't there. And so when you talk to folks in Brussels about both EU and national leaders, how are they looking at this? How do they possibly accept this idea that their future is being negotiated without them being part of the negotiations? I remember in Munich a year ago, I remember a week away from the Munich Security Conference this year, that this was it's totally unacceptable to have negotiations without the Europeans there. And yet, we're having negotiations without the Europeans there.
Yeah, I mean, that is what's happening. And I think the strategy has been to try and get Trump's ear as much as possible ahead of key moments. And we saw that the Alaska summit over the summer, for example. And, and again, this issue that people really are engaged with, like who is making the decisions, that there is a point when Trump comes in, and that's actually when the decision has been made. Now, national security advisors are involved to an extent, and that's about the height of it. But, senior officials in the cabinets of the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, and the European Council President, Antonio Costa, they were in Geneva for those talks recently, for example. But yes, look, they're on the outside here on this. Now, I mean, where the real conversation are happening would be in NATO, as you would know. And next week, we're going to have actually a defense ministers meeting right on the eve of Munich, actually, in Brussels. Unclear if the US Defense Secretary will be there, but, that's where those discussions, I think, are happening. A bit more, often. But look, I mean, this week, the EU signed off on its 90 billion loan to Ukraine. And that's kind of a big milestone. They'd agreed it in December, but they're one of the issues there is, will the UK be able to participate in that in some or non-EU countries, and on what terms? They're talking about a fee to kind of cover the cost of that. So they're going ahead with that financial commitment for Ukraine, because now that is the lifeline. That is the Ukrainian lifeline. I mean, everyone was very clear that April, this money needs to get moving. They were reaching this funding cliff. The IMF as well are very involved in this, obviously, with their own loan program, but they see it as predicated on the EU one too. So I think that role that the EU is playing there and keeping the show on the road, and some of that funding goes to military help, but some of it is going to the day-to-day running of Ukraine. That is an important element that the Europeans are committed to and are continuing to. And just as we're speaking now, they've agreed the 20th sanctions package on Russia. So they're still they're still continuing to try and hit Russia, try and look at some of these loopholes. They're including in this sanctions package, for example, some metals, hitting the shadow fleet. So that work is still ongoing, even though, yes, they're not at the table for these big, peace discussions that may shape the future of the continent.
I mean, I think even though they haven't been directly at the table, I do think it's worth, and you mentioned this yourself, Suzanne, about at key moments some of the European leaders have been involved. And I think there, Starmer of Finland, Jonathan Powell, actually at national security level, have been rather crucial in shaping things and also guiding in many ways Zelensky in his tactics and strategy, how to approach and handle Trump. I mean, the $90 billion package has been crucial, of course, but it will only really keep funding going for a year if you work it out. Most analysis would suggest they need about 90 to 100 billion a year. So, I mean, it's put off the crunch for another year, but we could be facing the same problem of Ukraine being short of funds, and then that's going to be very hard in a year's time to get that money together again when you've got some crucial elections coming up in Europe.
Catherine, I think that's a good point. But as a close observer, you travel back and forth to Kyiv a lot. It seems to me there are three discussions going on, and there are three parallel discussions. There's a discussion that is happening with regard to the peace, which is all about making sure that Donald Trump doesn't get angry at either Moscow or Kyiv, and hopefully get you somewhere. There's a discussion in Europe about how do we support Ukraine since the United States is no longer doing it. And then there's a discussion in Kyiv, which is how do we survive? With everything that is going on, both on the front line, and we've had some really interesting things happening there with regard to Starlink, which you might want to talk a little about. But also, I think what are temperatures there now? It's below zero
-20.
Fahrenheit, about minus 20 centigrade without heating, without electricity. This is very tough. So help us understand how these three things actually, work together.
Yeah. I was chatting with a friend yesterday in Kharkiv, and it was minus 28. And it's just hard to imagine at all. So I think that you put that really well, Ivo, the fact that these three different siloed conversations are taking place. I mean, obviously they bleed into one another, but essentially I don't see that anything has changed from what Moscow is asking from the very beginning of this process. And it feels to me a little bit like this is becoming a little bit like the Middle East peace process, with Moscow in the role of Israel, keeping the conversation going for the sake of it. Ukraine obviously is in this to survive, and Europe's lifeline is making sure that it can do that. But I just a few days before Christmas, I was in Sloviansk, which is one of the cities along that line, that defensive line that Putin wants Ukraine to give up with the rest of the Donbass, the bit that he hasn't taken. Ukraine's not giving that up. It's not going to happen. I mean, I'm afraid, sorry to be the doomster or gloommeister or whatever is Boris would say about this, but I've really held a pretty much the same opinion of this, with a little bit of wriggle room since about a year into the conflict, that we're heading for a very long war of attrition. And that's only if Ukraine can actually stay in the fight. I don't see a settlement happening at the table that all these different people are prepared to sign up to. So it's, as you say, it's become this process of managing the moods and the tempers on different sides, chiefly Donald Trump's. That could account for the Kremlin lowering the rhetoric a bit. Ukraine, Zelensky's trying to sort of not get under his feet too much, but ultimately none of the fundamentals have changed, and Europe doesn't want to reward Putin for his aggression. It doesn't serve their interests, and it puts everyone on the continent in jeopardy.
Yeah, I think I mean I share that view. I think ultimately this has been a massive effort to massage one person's ego. That's why we're engaged in these negotiations. No one wants to be on the wrong side of Donald Trump because the cost of the consequences that can be severe. That's true for the Europeans. It's certainly true for the Ukrainians and to some extent to the Russians. But the essence of the war is Putin wants something that the Ukrainians can't give them, and Ukraine wants something that Putin wants to take away, and that's what this war has all been about. And the rest is unfortunately history. It is interesting that the dynamic on the ground seemed to be shifting a little bit towards Russian, certainly over the last 6 months. In part, apparently, because they were getting access to Starlink internet and finding out what in that way finding a little bit out what the Ukrainians were doing. And Elon Musk, in another one of these incredible parts of this story, has now decided that he's going to interfere in the ability of Russians to access Starlink, and they seem to be a little disoriented as a result. That'll be resolved, I'm sure, in a matter of weeks. But in the meantime, it just shows that one individual can have a huge amount of influence on a war like this. Fascinating discussion. We're talking with Catherine Philp of the London Times, Jamie Dettmer of Politico, and Suzanne Lynch of Bloomberg. Suzanne, let me come to you on our final sort of issue, which is I have a sense, but this is from looking from the U.S., but reading the European press, including all of your great reportings, that something has fundamentally shifted in Europe when it comes to the economic relationship with the United States. A sense that, it used to be thought that the transatlantic economic relationship was the foundation that would keep everything going. But the weaponization of that relationship by President Trump over the last year is now leading Europeans to say, wait a minute, we need to reduce our dependence. We need to de-risk, to use the European talks and all these new things, buying European and digital sovereignty, etc. How you are reporting on this day to day. How do you see the mood? Has it shifted? And if so, what does that mean? And then finally, will Europe be able to take the pain that in fact de-risking implies, at least short-term pain, even if in the long term it may benefit them? How do you look at this whole issue?
Yeah, I think the mood has changed significantly since the Greenland crisis. So, first of all, there was obviously the threat of the United States annexing Greenland in and of itself, but also Donald Trump's decision or announcement of new tariffs, threatening countries with new tariffs because they weren't backing his position on Greenland. That really panicked people because they felt last July, they signed this trade deal with the United States, and the Europeans accepted pretty much a suboptimal deal, 15% tariffs, and there's still huge tariffs on steel and aluminum, for example. Not all of that has been resolved, and they thought they got the best they could have hoped for. And the idea that really this was all back on the table again, I think really illustrated the fact that the United States was no longer a partner of any kind of trustworthiness. And it's also been a big hit for the European Union's confidence. I mean, the EU, after all, I mean, I've just already mentioned this. I mean, it's not a foreign policy power. It is an economic power. It's a big market of 450 million people. It was, founded as a coal and steel community, as an economic project. People say, yeah, it was after World War II and a peace building project, but fundamentally it was an economic project as well. And that has always been its strength, its single market. So the fact that it kind of, when it came to it, it blinked and wasn't able to get a better deal, I think was a real, it was a real wake up call for Europe. So you're right. I mean, you're hearing a lot now, and Emmanuel Macron, the French president, was the person talking about this for years, but this idea of strategic autonomy, that the Europeans need to be more dependent on themselves, both in terms of their military power, and we have seen a huge increase, a ramping up of defense spending since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but also that they cannot depend on trusted partners, particularly that transatlantic relationship. Now, like everyone else, they have realized they've got vulnerability issues on critical raw materials. You know, you've got a situation where everyone is looking for the same critical raw materials. They're trying to do trade deals. They finally got their Mercosur trade deal with the 4 South American countries, which was going on for more than 20 years. They got that over the line. They also signed a trade deal with India, which is very significant as well. They're hoping to do something similar, maybe the UAE and Australia in the coming months. But I do think that the really interesting one to watch is digital and the digital regulation, because this is an issue that, you know, we were talking about JD Vance last year at Munich. He has made it very clear that he sees it as a freedom of speech issue. Just this week in Congress, the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing, and the name was something that was like Europe's attack on free. But, you know, it was actually about European regulation and about the DSA and all these tech laws. So, you know, US officials, US politicians are very aware of EU tech regulation, and they're learning more about it. They're not happy. Now, in one way, you could say this has always been a point of tension. This I was first in Brussels well over, you know, about 14, 15 years ago. And during the relationship between Obama and Merkel, and everything was going so well. But this issue, the Americans were never happy with the idea that the EU, what they thought was over-regulating their tech companies. Now, one of the reasons is because the Europeans don't have their own tech companies. This is what they're trying to address. They're realizing that they've fallen behind when it comes to innovation, particularly in the tech space. So you have got this paradox that the EU's big regulatory heft that it has is being brought to bear mainly on US companies. So how far are they going? You know, is Trump going to fight this? Who knows? I mean, the US tech companies also want the European market. So again, Europe does have some leverage here, and the European public, we hear a lot about frustration with EU regulation. The one aspect of EU regulation that the European public like is regulation of tech companies. There's huge moves now at a national level, in particular, about 10 countries now. Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, was the latest to say he's looking at a ban of some kind of social media ban for minors. So I think this source of tension is going to be an interesting one to watch over the coming months.
Suzanne, that's excellent. I just think you really nailed that whole discussion in a really, really fascinating way. And Jamie, I just on the digital side, because I think that is the one thing that most Americans, in some ways, are also grappling with. You know, we had the situation with X and the ability to use AI to show people in their nudity, which had a great outcry in the United States, but nobody's doing anything about it, and they are doing it in Europe.
Well, there are differences, aren't there? I mean, the difference in terms of the law, the constitutional guarantees of free speech, etc., makes it far more complicated in the States. I do agree with Suzanne. I think that this clash over regulating the tech companies, you know, is a crucial one. You've got tech companies owned by people who are backing Trump these days. He'll carry on batting for them as well. X and other of these social media sites and platforms are very useful for the MAGA world as it tries to expand and sculpt the populists in Europe to be more of their eyes and more successful, etc. So I think that's going to be an ugly fight. The de-risking thing, you know, the great problem for Europe is this: it is behind on tech. It doesn't have tech champions. It is falling behind on AI. It can make trade deals with China and India. Carney was over in China the other day talking about being a reliable trade partner. But those trade deals also involve finished goods coming from China, flooding into Europe from China, coming from India, and contribute to a further deindustrialization of Europe. Europe needs desperately, and Draghi laid this out, Mario Draghi, in the competitive report, you know, to get far more real about integrating the European market, you know, finding ways of encouraging champions, deregulating, reindustrializing again, making things again. That is going to take time, and there are going to be lots of vested interest trying to block that. But, you know, Europe is in a very difficult position. It can turn towards China and India, but as I said, it risks eroding its industrial base even further. It needs America to sell what goods it has. The American market is important. It's a real challenge for Europe.
Catherine, as a Brit, as someone who reports from the UK, this is a slightly uncomfortable conversation in
I was
the sense
just
that
going to say that. Yes.
yeah. So how is Britain, which is of course has the strongest relationship to the United States through the special relationship or whatever you want to call it, at least believes it has the strongest relationship to the United States, and yet is subject to the same kind of forces that have generated this disquiet inside Russia that Suzanne so well described. And so the choice is clear, but no one wants to make it. It seems to be in terms of the UK. So how is the UK handling this?
Very awkwardly. I mean, it's said that Brexit just gets more wrong with every year that passes, and now it really feels wrong. If Europe is in a difficult spot, a tight spot, then be Britain, be stuck between the two. And we see what happened when Starmer did attempt to diversify with trade and went to China. Trump went off the roof about it. I think that Starmer has got his own domestic problems, and they're very, very deep at the moment. So he's perhaps not on the cusp of pursuing this closer and closer reunion, I should say, with Europe. But they are going to have to get closer, whoever's in charge and whatever they do, simply to hedge, I suppose. I mean, we were talking there just about Ukraine and the fact that one man, Elon Musk, can make a decision on Starlink, and he's made it in the other direction before as well, that he cut Ukraine off at certain points. This is, you could say this about the entire defense industry, as well as the tech one, that as long as you buy American, you hand America a kill switch. I mean, would China or Russia, not that we're going to start getting weapons from them, because we're obviously not, but would they do that in a commercial relationship with someone that they've sold weapons to? Trump is certainly happy to threaten those kind of things. And I think and these things take a very long time, far longer to change than, tech regulation and stuff. So I think that for Britain, for Europe, for a lot of countries around the world, this issue of who do they buy their weapons from or their defensive systems from in the future, it's going to take decades to solve.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And Suzanne, I want to come back to you as sort of for a final point, because I believe there's a European Council meeting next week, which will have this issue at the center. I believe that both Letta, the former Prime Minister Enrico Letta, and Mario Draghi, the two people who wrote the great reports on European competitiveness, will be present for this, and a real discussion about how do we take all the issues that Jamie and you and everyone has laid out, all the difficulties, how are we going to overcome this? Do you see this as a kind of meeting that is really going to move the goalposts in a fundamental way, or?
It'll be talk. It will be a lot of European talk. But I mean, the very fact that they're having this meeting, they're saying that it's a discussion about purely competitiveness, and it's in rural Belgium, and they're actually the Antwerp kind of summit the day before with a lot of businesses, and it's them showing that they're actually not just about politics, that they're actually listening to concerns of businesses. But their big issue, and I mean, Jamie is right there, everything saying about building up this industrial debate. What I think though is interesting is because the EU is not a country, right? And you've got these 27 different countries, you've got 27 very different economies. So a lot of the smaller countries worry that if you're talking about, pumping maybe public money or more private or public-private money into industry, that it's going to be the big countries that are going to benefit. It's going to be Germany and France. So small countries, I'm from Ireland, for example, Ireland, Estonia, Finland, extremely advanced, wealthy economies. They are successful because of trade. They don't want to be, building, lithium factories in their country. They don't have the capacity. They don't want to do that. They are thriving on trade. So I think that's where the rubber hits the road here, because within the EU, you have different ideas. Now, to an extent, everyone has moved more, I think post-COVID as well, to the realization, look, we need to have more. We can't just outsource everything. We need to be able to depend on ourselves. I think even the most free market members are like that. And of course, Britain, speaking of Britain, I mean, Britain was always the advocate of, deregulation, less intervention. And you can see the absence of Britain now in an extent, smaller countries who would have depended on Britain to fight that corner, missed that voice. France was always, not to stereotype too much, but France has a more protectionist outlook in that sense. And Macron, now maybe he's been proved right on this. So yeah, look, I think you're going to see some things on AI. I mean, I think what Jamie was saying there's a real concern, and this is where it hits the regulation. So on the one hand, the EU public want Europe to crack down on Grok, on any AI. But at the same time, Draghi himself said in September that he thinks part of the AI Act needs to be looked at because it may hinder innovation. So, you've got two different impulses there. So it's very hard to keep everyone happy on this. But I think the other thing is the financial market. So Europe has long had an investment problem in terms of they've got, billions, trillions on savings. And your ordinary European is not as invested in the markets as the way your ordinary American is. And there's a huge issue there about unlocking that capital. And I think that's in the financial sector, and trying to make that easier. I think that's going to be a key focus for the Europeans.
Part of the problem is also, as you alluded to, Suzanne, you got 27 national governments, all competing, in a sense, to make sure that they get, their champions are rewarded, their electorates are rewarded. It is very, very hard to blend all of this. And then you have on top of that people who are disruptors like Orban, who's may or may not win his election in April again, against this backdrop of national conservatives and populism still strong, still surging in some countries. It's a very difficult challenge.
Difficult, but perhaps necessary, and I think that is the challenge for Europe in 2026. The old ways don't work anymore. You can't rely on cheap energy from Russia. You can't rely on open markets from China. And it looks like you increasingly cannot rely on security from the United States. And that's a dilemma that Europe seems to be facing, and everyone is going to be grappling with it, even as at the same time they are dealing with their own domestic politics. It's a complicated situation, but I can't think of three more intelligent people to help us understand how complicated it is, and to point to some ways than Suzanne Lynch of Bloomberg News, Catherine Philp of The Times, and Jamie Dettmer of Politico Europe. Thank you so much for joining us, and I want to thank all of you for joining us and today and every week to listen to World Review. World Review is a Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs podcast presented by the Harvard Kennedy School. This week's episode, as every episode, was produced by Tectonic Video. I am Ivo Daalder. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a grand week.